Hey everybody, thanks for joining us here for another mission vlog with our man in Europe, Brian McClure. Brian, how you doing, bro?
It's great. It's great to be back, and I'm doing well.
You know, it's just good to see the flying WV in the state of West Virginia in the middle of Prague.
You know, I have to thank Mountaineers for that. They brought me an incredible gift from the capital, and I just display it proudly so that everybody that talks to me knows. True.
Oh yeah,
Blue
you
and
gotta
gold.
know. You gotta know. We brought you a football jersey. I don't even remember that once. We brought you a football jersey.
Of course I do. I still wear it when it's game day. Next time, next conversation, I'll put it on.
Yeah, there we go. Perfect. So today we're going to talk about sort of missionary misconceptions. Brian, I'm sure you talk to a lot of short-term teams. You talk to a lot of long-term missionaries. You are a long-term cross-cultural worker. You talk to a lot of churches when you're stateside, and I know there's all kinds of sort of ideas. There's almost this mythology around the missionary himself or herself. So I want to just have a conversation today about missionary misconceptions, expectations versus reality. So from your conversations with church people and short-term trip people, what are some common misconceptions or at least misguided expectations that may be in our thinking about missionaries?
Well, the misconceptions can take a lot of different forms. I have misconceptions about lots of different things, and it's really fun to see when they join us on the field. Particularly, it's like, there are trams here, there are buses, I don't have to have a car. I mean, that seems simple, but when you're living in an urban setting, it really changes your perspective of time travel, distance. There's a ton of misconceptions about what life looks like. And even if we just did the concept of being sent, what that actually means for the place that's being receiving, the receiving country. For example, for me, I live in the Czech Republic, so receiving me as one that is sent out to plant and start churches, that can be an interesting conversation. Well, what did it look like when you were sent, or what did it look like being sent to East Asia? I think it looks different based upon the country of receiving and the expectation of the culture that we're living in. But some of the interesting ones that I struggle with and that I had is that we're so needed. I think that's one of those that's I'm needed to take the gospel to the ends of the earth. And it's true, we're called to do that, but God, I had a professor at Southeastern, his name Dr. Galliotti, and he always said God can use even the most crooked and bent stick to hit a straight lick. And I'm reminded by that to say, you know what, I am broken and bent, and God can use you, even a crooked stick like me, to hit a straight lick. And that's a great reminder for us as we're sent, that God doesn't need us. He's chosen to use us. And if we don't proclaim, what proclaims? Even the rocks will proclaim God's name. And so we are privileged to be able to be heralds and proclaim the name. So one of those misconceptions is that we're so needed, and then we're saviors. It's like, oh, you know, particularly coming from a white context, that's an interesting conversation for going to Africa, the white savior. And that's just not the case. You know, there is only one savior, and I'm not him. And his name is Jesus.
And he's not white.
I think that's one of the, and it's not even white. And particularly, if you're looking at like a post-Christian context, like Czech Republic, you know, that idea that God's already been here in the sense of Christianity. You look at the cathedrals, the churches, that's a whole different context than, say, a pre-Christian, where the gospel has never been. And so how you live looks different, how you interact with the people. But one of the things that's helpful is right expectations. That's how I often combat my unmet expectations, because I'm poor, and I still make expectations that this is what the next year is going to look like, or the next 5, or, you know, whatever that time frame is. And I have to remind myself, Brian, It's going to be slower than you expect. Not because God is slow to act, but his timing is a lot different than ours. And it's going to be more difficult. It's going to cost me more energy, blood, sweat, and tears than I counted, you know? And that's the thing, that the more you give, the more you love. It's kind of like, for me, our kids, I have 3 of them. When I give one of my kids some love and attention, I love them more deeply. Yeah, it costs me tears financially, you know, wrote all over the wall. Well, got to repaint that. You know, I love them more deeply. Why? Because I have more invested in it. And that's the same thing for us. I think God chooses, as Hudson Taylor said, God uses men who are weak and feeble enough to lean on him. And I really think that's what our true expectation is. We're going to lean on him for him to make disciples, to plant churches, and we're going to follow him wherever he leads us. And particularly, he's on mission. And I think the greatest expectation that anyone could have going across cultures and being a part of planting churches is knowing that you're going to be on mission with Jesus and you're going to get to know Jesus more deeply. Why? Because he sent us. He was sent, and we're going to know him more deeply. And for me, that's the greatest encouragement.
Yeah, that's really helpful. You know, I think a big theme in what you're saying is taking the focus off of ourselves and putting it on God. And, you know, it sounds like a lot of the misconceptions deal with ourselves and our experience and our self-esteem. And I think in some ways in Baptist culture, Baptist life, we can glorify missionaries to where that when you start to become one, you might start to sort of bask in that glory a little bit.
Correct. Yeah.
You know,
you can wean it. It's like, I'm just a poor, you know, X. I can't afford a new
humble
computer.
Brag. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
Or we've only planted 50,000 churches, you know. But it was really God.
But right, of course, you have to put that qualifier in there. And then there's like, I'm the one who's actually being obedient, while the rest of you
You're not.
Yeah. The implicit is like, you know, there's all these people, you know, all these people are just listening to the gospel each week, and there's all these people dying, going to hell, and I'm one of the only ones who are actually going to help save them all. And I think like there's always ounces of truth in all of those things, but if the focus comes to ourselves, then it's just dangerous, man.
It is very dangerous. Because it's you nailed it. You hit the head on the nail on the head with saying it's not about us. You know, this mission is about God and his glory. And that's a great reminder for myself as well. Yeah.
So how do you think in the sort of missionary mythology lines up with your missionary experience or the missionary experience in general?
There's a lot of experiences that we have. I think particularly mine in a post Christian world is that we have to build relationships, for example, to be bold with the gospel, or we have to wait to have 5 cups of coffee before we're bold and say, hey, we're followers of Jesus and we love him, and this is what's priority for our lives, and that's what has brought me here, or this is why I live the way I live, because the gospel changes everything. And I think some of the mythology is that we have to necessarily adapt all cultural norms, and that's just not reality, and that's not life. Why? Because God has called us to send out ones, not ones that just blend in. And I think there's some uniquenesses. One of the things I talk about with short-term teams, there's uniquenesses to our Americanness that is incredibly helpful for the global church. And the opposite is true. The global church can have incredible things to say about America that I have learned by being with my brothers and sisters. They know how to fellowship like we don't. And so, and they know how to speak the gospel into areas of life that I just haven't learned yet. And so one of the things is we're better together than we are isolated. And that's one of those mythologies. We have the truth and the way to do it. Well, we have a lot of experience. We have a great quantity of believers in a lot of ways. But is that necessarily true for the new path forward in a post-Christian world? And I argue, no, it isn't. And so I think that our mythology can sway the way that we act and live if we're not grounded well in Scripture, ultimately, but also in healthy practices.
Hmm. Yeah, and I'm sure the actual missionary experience is not a monolith, right? It's not this thing
No,
that
it's
looks
not.
the same throughout time and space. So dig into that a little bit. I mean, I'm sure it would vary broadly. I mean, your experience versus our
It
other partner
does.
and
Yeah.
Asia's experience. I mean,
Yeah.
it's quite different. So explore that a little bit.
Yeah, and so like I think you've been in South and East Asia. So whenever I've been in South and East Asia, I walk into a market and I am at times a head taller, and I'm not that tall of a guy.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
5'7", and so you have different skin color. Um, we have different facial features. The way that we communicate is very differently, and so we have an ability to attract that in the Western world, particularly in Europe, it just
mm.
doesn't apply. We
No,
blend
no,
in, and no
yeah,
one here in Prague says, "Wow, this is a weird. Why is he in here
yeah,
in the market?"
yeah,
And so one of the aspects to our experience dictates how we go about leveraging the gifts or talents that we have that God has given us, the experiences like an engineer. And
mm,
I'm thinking about if someone would go to a country like Malaysia, where they have a program set up um, for those that are wanting to retire in Malaysia to attract them.
mm,
And, if that is your experience, what does that mean? I think that God has created us and gifted us with things to leverage those talents, gifts, and experiences for his kingdom. And if
mm,
it is an attractional model, that's good, but it can't be only attractional. Is it a
yeah,
missional? Yes, it has to be missional, but it can't only be missional. It has to be attractional because it has to be both. And
mm,
I don't know if you're familiar. I think you're probably quite familiar, but I don't know. Our audience is familiar with that model of being sent out versus a magnet pulling.
yeah,
And those are the things that we have to do both well. And
yeah,
in a post-Christian context, I think it's essential to do both well.
yeah, yeah. Have you had much experience in rural settings? I know you're in an urban setting right now, but I imagine too urban versus rural. We've talked a little bit about that, but it's probably quite different as well.
Well, no, my experience primarily the past 10 years has been urban. I
Yeah,
have worked alongside church planners and I do coaching
yeah,
with church planners in more rural, but rural, when we're talking rural, and we have to define what rural is, but a town of 50,000. And when I say 50,000,
oh yeah,
like Raleigh, North Carolina, Raleigh, Durham has about 1 million people, and the population density is quite different than it is in Prague, and
mm,
the size is much smaller than Raleigh because of the way American cities are built. And so
yeah,
rural in European context, there's not as many rural places as you'd think,
yeah, yeah,
but they're more rural than say like Weatherford, Oklahoma. Like
yeah,
you're like, where's Weatherford?
yeah,
Yeah, exactly. No one
yeah,
knows. Yeah, I know where it is, but
yeah,
um,
yeah. I don't. I know where Charleston, West Virginia is, and it's got 49,000 people. We got to get that number up,
yeah,
man. We got to get
yeah,
up outside of rural. We got to get to 70, 80,000 where we should be. I've
yeah,
always heard, fun fact, Charleston and Charlotte in the 80s were the same size. I've always heard that.
yeah.
Like
Hmm.
80-ish thousand people, and then Charlotte skyrockets and we dip. But I think this sort of urban Appalachia, man, I think we got a lot to offer. So before we get too
I
off track,
agree.
I think another part of the missionary mythology is that it's like, there's a lyric I really don't like in one of those old hymns that's, though none go with me, I still will follow.
Hmm.
And one of the reasons I don't like it, I like the principle, like, if everyone forsakes me, I'll still go. Um, but the ancient faith confesses faith in the communion of saints, that we're never really alone, that
Yeah,
we go with a great community of people.
yeah,
And
we do.
I think in many ways, the missionary task we often think of as like me and my wife, or just me as a female, right? Whoever goes. Um,
Hmm.
but I wonder if the experience is that individualized, or, because chances are you're not the first person there, and
No.
by God's grace, you're not going to be the last person there. Again,
Mm-mm.
that will be different in some pioneer contexts, but
Correct.
how do you fit into sort of other cross-cultural workers on the field? Uh, how do those
Yeah.
previous,
So
current, and future workers interact with you?
yeah. So that's a great question because what does that mean for moving forward? Because
Hmm.
we allow our history to inform our future, right?
Yeah,
We want to
yeah,
learn from those that have come before us, and we stand on the shoulders of the men before us or the women before us. And that's the reality of our lives. And yeah, there are pioneer contexts in a pre-Christian world that has never experienced the church, the evangelical body of Christ. And so in that, we interact and we want to be alongside our brothers and sisters, have like-minded hearts and that desire. And for example, in the city, actually broader in the country, there's over 30 different mission sending agencies that have presence or work in the country. So oftentimes we think, oh, I'm going to, alongside our brothers and sisters that are also engaged in this task as well. And so I think about men that have gone before me, like a Harold Johnson, who really, I had very little contact with Harold. We knew each other. I'd spoken. I'd been to his house. But other than that, Harold and I didn't interact. I wasn't terribly influenced by him, but I was particularly influenced through his work. And there was a man that who is a leader in the Baptist Union that said, you know what, if it wasn't for Harold, I wouldn't be where I am today in leading the missions department, essentially, of the Baptist Union. And what I mean by that, not that he created this great leader, but God used his faithful servant heart to impact a pastor that also helped to impact the city they're living in and other surrounding cities by planting churches, as well as the union in large. And if you would ask Harold, you'd probably say, wow, I wasn't terribly successful. Harold actually said that right before he leaves. I don't feel like I was a great success because the church plant that he worked in was never self-sustaining. It wasn't propagating. It wasn't multiplying, even disciples. And that was always a frustrating point for Harold. And I would say, Harold, you weren't a failure. And if Harold would see this, he would say, Brian, thank you so much for your encouragement, because that's reality. We want to be faithful where God has called us. And probably God's going to look down on Harold's faithfulness through the health problems that he's had, through the children's struggles in the city that he was in. And that's really the reality is that we stand and we're participating with God in a one little thread of a carpet that he is weaving to bring about the story and the incredible fruition of a plan that started before the creation of the world. And honestly, that impacts our strategy. Where is the gospel not gone? And I could name multiple cities that we're focusing and praying and asking the Lord for workers for in the country. Why? Because that's our trajectory, centrifugal and sending out, not coming together, right? So so that the workers come before us and they influence everything that we do.
And I think team dynamics too probably play a bigger role in the missionary life than one may think on the front end.
Yeah, it does. Conflict is a huge, even with nationals. How do you resolve conflict? That's a misunderstanding. Is that one of the things is that I will probably never leave because of working with other people on my mission team. And when I say that, workers sent from America, and that's number one reason people leave. Really, it's conflict with another co-laborer. Why? Because we're sinful people and we have opinions and passionate. And the type of workers that are long-term sent out are oftentimes very strong-willed. That's one of the reasons they stick, but also why they have a lot of conflict. One of the resources that's needed for workers is having conflict resolution and learning to speak truth in a way that is building up, but also unifying.
I had a friend, our viewers don't know him. I don't know all our viewers, of course, but hopefully we have more than just my mom. He told me once that if he left the field, it would be because of financial, not like doesn't have his needs met. Just like whenever money enters relationships, it just gets so complicated. And the dynamics of expectations that a missionary has some sort of financial role to play in the life of these churches, and then correcting that and is working through that is just so difficult. So I think sometimes there's, from the outside looking in at cross-cultural life, those team dynamics, you don't think they're going to kill you, but it can kill you, or it can get you off the field.
Yes, it can.
Financial issues, not in the sense of not having enough, but in the sense of stewarding limited resources for a great mission in front of you, and then other people think you should be funding this or funding that. Just like in the U.S., everyone's got an opinion about how you should spend money, and so I think some of those things can get hard. And there's probably, I don't think we really prepped to talk about this much, but your experience as a missionary is going to be so contingent upon the role you play on a particular team.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yep. And the role in the team. So if you're a team leader versus a team member, what does that supervisory relationship look like versus a colleague relationship? And how these relationships, for example, one of the things that's very difficult about my sending organization is that we want to focus that we're a family of God, and yet there's this supervisory and you have this human resource aspect to it, where you have possibility of your colleague, co-laborer, giving you a corrective action, which is a punitive, well, it's not always punitive, it's more bringing you back into appropriate actions and habits that will be effective for the mission and for your good. And so that dynamic is difficult. My dad, he might say something, but he can't kick me out of the family. Like, hello, like, I'm in, and you have this, oh no, we can kick you out. And so we can struggle in these dilemma of, where do I fall with this person? Am I a family member conversation, or am I a supervisory conversation? And when those get mixed, it can be very difficult.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, as we wrap up, we've kind of given some unique approaches, I think, to the missionary mythology, and avoided some of the cliches. I think in many ways, where do you think they come from, the mythology? Does it come from the way we preach about it, the stories we tell, the missionary biographies that we read and should read? Where do you think the mythology comes from? Or just our own wild dreams about what life is like on the, in the ethereal other?
No, I think it comes from our culture primarily. Why? Because we all believe that we can, well, when you ever use all, many of us believe it's so deep in our mentality that we can change the world. And we can, to a degree. We can change the world for one person. But the reality is that, these countries that in Europe particularly have been around for a millennia, twice as long as America. And one of the ideas in the Czech culture is, if there's this regime or that regime comes into our country, we'll just lay down like a bend down like wheat in the wind. And when that goes away, we'll stand back up. And so like this enduring. And Americans have this idea, and I am one of them, so I'm often blind to my own culture at times, but being out of it for 10 years helps me see a little bit more clearly that we often think that we can conquer the world, and that's what makes us great. We're not afraid to risk and to move out into something unknown or unknown. And so that's one of the aspects that makes us incredible, but also makes us very dangerous on the other side, is because why? We're the great savior to whatever country we're going. And that's the danger. Every characteristic has a bad side to it, right? So I think that's one of the aspects.
Yeah, it's almost like this perfect confluence of this Protestant individualism with this American manifest destiny that can become an unchecked desire that the whole world should practice the faith in the way that I do. The reality is we want the whole world to practice the Christian faith in the ways that they are created to practice it in their redeemed cultures. And I think without that nuance, I think some of that mythology, you're right, that's good. That does come from our culture. I'm reading the Judson biography right now, the Golden Shore. And I think sometimes...
Good, that's a great one.
Oh man, so good. But I think sometimes we read that and we think like, I am the next Judson. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And like in some ways,
I want to be him.
Yeah, yeah. In some
Yeah.
ways, I think that's a healthy motivation that we follow faithful men and women.
Hmm.
And in some ways, it's true that there will be many turns in our life where we feel like a failure. But even this story you're telling about Brother Harold, like when you look back and write a story from the back to the front, um, it gives us a good perspective about the change that we did make.
Hmm.
But sometimes I think we read these and we just get so fired up about going to do it. And I
Yeah.
think that should happen. But pastorally, as we wrap it up, I found that conflict, burnout, making really poor decisions and or leaving the faith, right? They'll often come from like expectations aren't met, and then expectations aren't met, and expectations aren't met. And what happens is
Yep.
that drives them to despair rather than driving them to God. And I think um, we're kind of landing this plane is that in the middle of it all is this constant pursuit of God. When your
Hmm.
misconceptions about what your team is, what your relationship with nationals are like, what they think of you, right? All these sorts of things,
Hmm.
as that self-idealism begins to shatter, like a truly healthy, gracious realism of who God is and what He's called us to do can sort of rise in its place. So, any
Hmm.
final thoughts or resources you would point folks to as they work through sort of how have I always thought about what a missionary is versus what would that experience actually be like?
Yeah, there's a one article I think that was extremely helpful that I've read that Andy Johnson wrote, and 5 Myths About Missions, and he really breaks down well what are some of these myths that we believe about
Mhm.
missions, and one of them is missions is only for the young, and that's just not
Mm,
reality. Another is
yeah,
contextualization, or contextualizing the message is the key. Um, it is a key, but it's not the key.
yeah,
And so,
yeah.
so, and I think it's very helpful to thinking about this idea. And he breaks down this. We talk about we want to have multi-generational,
Hmm.
this movement of God, which is really a great thing, but it can be
Yeah.
very dangerous. And I think that he
Hmm.
breaks that down quite well, because we want to have a church that plants a church, and those are exceptional. They're not normative in a lot
Yeah.
of our cases. Why? And so I think that that's helpful to remind ourselves that if we only say this, we could sacrifice um, producing a pine tree when we want an oak. And oak takes longer. Pines fall down if they're not together. There's different aspects if we want to compare it to a tree,
Yeah.
to what church planting. So I think that's a great resource, and there's others, but I think that one would be
Sure.
helpful to start with.
Yeah, great. And I would just add too, like I mentioned to the Golden Shores missionary biographies, like read those, but read them with the understanding that you're reading about a human, not
Absolutely.
reading about
Yeah.
an angel or someone who's immune to pain and suffering. And in many ways, I think you can mythologize those stories, but you can also look at some suffering and the struggles and the rejection and the pain,
Yes.
and that
Yep.
can be a thing that sort of keeps you from this
Yep.
unhealthy mythology. And that why does that even matter? It matters because it's going to
Hmm.
impact your experience on the field. It's going to impact your walk with Christ. It's going to impact your understanding of yourself and the work you're doing.
It
So
does. Yeah.
read those books, realize they're humans just like you, and keep plugging in. Brian, man, thanks for joining us.
It's a joy. Look forward to the next one.
All right, man, we'll talk soon. Thanks for viewing, guys. We hope you're doing well, and we hope you continue thinking about these issues related to missions. Have a good one.